as though I turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when I lifted it.
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief.
A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one.
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing.
Well, my name is Ron Block, and I come from Gothenburg, Nebraska. My family has been there for well over 100 years. There are 33 listings in the phone book for Block in Gothenburg. That means 33 families. So that town has kind of grown more from like families growing than from, you know, people moving into the town. The influences are kind of odd. Sometimes I think I've been influenced by folk tales and fairy tales quite a bit. I've always been influenced by people who can tell a story rather than writing a story. I always enjoy the people in my hometown who just can spin a story and keep you on the hook as they're telling it to you. So I guess I see that my influences are sort of partly from a kind of a written tradition that's not necessarily from Nebraska. It could include, you know, people like, you know, the Grimm's brothers, Kafka, and also something that's very much a folk tradition that comes right out of Nebraska. I became kind of obsessed with The Wizard of Oz, and I have this thing that I wanted to start writing. That I knew what its first sentence would be. It would be, my wife's name is Dorothy and she is from Kansas, and it would just sort of unfold from there, because, you know, The Wizard of Oz is the central myth of our culture. I mean, you know, if there's a, we don't have an epic poem, right? Unless it's Casey at the Bat or something like that. But we have The Wizard of Oz, and everyone knows about it, and it's a common frame of reference. I started like paying attention to how many times people would make reference to The Wizard of Oz, and you can't get through a day without hearing someone invoke The Wizard of Oz. The type of humor that I like involves contrast too. It sort of gets together something that is innocent with something that's not so innocent, something that is dark with something that's joyous. And I like the tension between those two things. And so, like, sometimes people say that I'm whimsical, and then they say I'm grim. Grim whimsy. Those things belong together for me. I didn't really think about people in my hometown reading my short story collection when I was writing. I didn't think about that at all. And then after it was published, I started to wonder what my aunts and uncles are going to think of some of the stranger stories, and it started to worry me. As a matter of fact, I got an invitation to go out to a book club in Paxton, Nebraska, and I tried to talk them out of it, because I couldn't see myself sitting in a living room with who I imagined these people to be, and talking about. Say, one of my stories is about a man who meets an old girlfriend, and she's dressed throughout the story as a clown. And she leads him through these elaborate kind of bizarre rituals. How are these people going to react to that sort of stuff? I just imagine myself just sitting there talking about it, and they just blink at me. I think everyone should have writing in their life. You know, I think it should be just, it shouldn't necessarily think about it as a career. You should think about it as a place that you go to, where you can be honest with yourself. Because, you know, the blank page always listens. One direction I thought about going is, the last story in my collection is more just almost like straight biography. People who know me say, this is not fiction at all, this is just biography. And I thought about exploring that, more of a, not even pretending that things are fictional. And if I would do that, I thought about doing 1 month, a month in North Dakota in February.
He's been described as the Sherwood Anderson for our times, funny, ironic, inventive, brimming with sympathy. But also, as in talking to him, he describes himself as having a real duality with his writing. Sometimes it's a little grim, sometimes it's a little humorous, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about that tonight too. His first work, Dismal River, a narrative poem, was published in 1990 by New Rivers Press. And most recently, he brings us Dirty Shame Hotel, which was also published by New Rivers Press in 1998. Kirkus Review says that, quote, at his very best, Block turns the dreariness of existence in Nebraska or the Dakotas into something approaching musical hymns to humanity. And he can catch the tone and pace of an Oral Garrison Keeler and tack it down for keeps. And I think that's quite an accomplishment, to say so. Both of these works have garnered him the Minnesota Voices Competition Award, which is one of the oldest literary competitions in the United States, which brings recognition and attention to writers living in the upper Midwest. So to have both works honored in that respect, I think is also a really great tribute. So I'm very pleased to have Ron here tonight. Let's welcome him and listen to his great works.
Thank you very much for coming. I didn't know what sort of crowd we would have with the weather doing its Nebraska thing. I drove through that weather for about several hundred miles, and to come here, and it's not that bad. The story I'm going to read is a story that I've read quite a few times before, and I want to read it again. This story is dedicated to all the kids in Nebraska who've have their lives that are under the control of crazy adults. And I used to be one of those kids, and now I'm one of the crazy adults. And this is called the Gothenburg Marching Band. We were the lousiest marching band in Nebraska, but the last person to figure that out was Mr. Jenke, our band director. He kept hauling us all over the place and begging people to let us march through their towns. We always figured he was way too big to be a band director anyway, about 6'7", and his arms hung down to his knees and flew all over the place, knocking over music stands, making the sheet music fly. Once he knocked a clarinet right out of a girl's mouth. He'd count out loud and spit too, especially during crescendos. But we couldn't help but to like him sometimes because we all kind of felt sorry for him. The main trouble with Mr. Jenke was that he'd get these ideas at the last minute, just before he forced us to march out at halftime or something. He'd say, okay, trumpets, instead of turning right at measure 36, turn left for 2 measures and then turn right, and it ended up looking like a pinball game. It was bad enough in concert band. Once we did the Warsaw Concerto, and he dragged out a PA system just before the concert without telling anyone and stuck the mic right inside the piano. He almost got sued over that one. But when it came to marching band season, then he really got out of hand. He forced us to go to harvest festivals and county fairs, all that. He even forced us to go to the Frontier Days out in Cheyenne, Wyoming. We drove there all the way from Gothenburg just to make fools of ourselves. You should have seen us. We kept bunching up and tripping over each other's heels because we had to march in place about 48 times. The float ahead of us kept stalling out, so we tried to march in a little slower, but that's hard to do when you've been trained to take exactly 8 steps every 5 yards. That's moving exactly 22.5 inches per step, and the stupid drummers only knew one cadence. They were drummers only because they couldn't carry a tune, couldn't think of one if they tried. And they didn't even care. If they weren't in band, they'd be in reform school. But then it was really weird. When we went past the judges' stand, we were all marching in perfect formation, toes pointed, everyone in step, ranked straight on the horizontal, vertical, and diagonal. A total fluke. Every single step was exactly 22.5 inches. We never marched like that before in our lives. Of course, we weren't playing any music at the time. No way could we play music and march that well all at once. We just marched to the cadence and scooted past the judges' stand as fast as we could. And almost like that, everyone started passing out, which is what comes of wearing wool dress uniforms when it's like 100 degrees out and you're blowing "There Is No Place Like Nebraska" for about 5 miles. The first one to pass out was this anemic trombone player, but we all thought she was just showing off. But then it was like a chain reaction. A tuba went down, 2 French horns, a flute, another trombone. All the drummers just stood around and smirked. But Mr. Jenke lost his head and screamed at all of us to do something. As far as Mr. Jenke being there to help you in an emergency, just forget it. We had all these horn blowers down for the count, and the woodwinds falling over them, and the drummers standing there and just laughing about it, and Mr. Jenke turning every which way and just standing there. Thank God for the Feck brothers. They started grabbing Coca-Colas out of the spectators' hands and dumping them on the casualties.
Those effects probably saved our lives. But the thing of it is just as soon as we got to the rodeo, deciding to put all of this out of our minds, we heard the rodeo announcer say over the loudspeaker that we got 3rd place. So we sneaked out of town that night before anyone figured it out. We snuck out with a trophy. The only trouble was that Mr. Jenke didn't know it had been a big mistake. He started to think that we were state champion caliber. So he signed us up for the Nebraska State Marching Band competition, a big deal. Thousands and thousands of people showed up for it. We tried to talk him out of it, but it didn't do any good. Pretty soon he started coming to school with charts and graphs and battle plans. They were all pretty amazing, X's and circles and figure eights all going into a tailspin. He was going to have us play Aquarius with a Latin flavor, he said. He was going to have us start out with the theme music for 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then we were going to end up with Elvis Presley's Viva Las Vegas for the kids in the audience, he said. It looked pretty grim. All we could do at that point was try to convince everyone we knew to stay far, far away. At least then we'd only make fools of ourselves in front of strangers. Every day he had us kick dancing and sidestepping and marching backward and doing 3/4 turns and even hopping once in a while. And there were a lot of collisions and who knows how many near misses. One day he tried to make us march after an ice storm, and people were slipping and splitting their lips on their mouthpieces, and a couple people almost knocked their front teeth out. But Mr. Jenke said he had everything planned and nothing could go wrong. We figured that he even planned for how many casualties we could stand before we broke ranks and started to run. But you know, it shouldn't be any surprise that we got better and better. We started believing we were a whole lot better than we were. That's the worst part. Of course, our folks didn't help things any because they thought we were the best marching band in the world, and that's only part of the reason why you can't trust anyone who loves you. We marched through leaves, we marched through snow. We finally stopped complaining because we were numb. And then there came that one morning when we all got up about 4 o'clock and got ready for the long ride. The drummers had spent the night with hypodermic needles injecting oranges with vodka. The trumpets and trombone guys were all looking pretty beat up because they played a football game the night before. When they were 40 points behind, our boys begged the coach just to let them give up, but he wouldn't. No way. That coach was another story. The clarinets arrived with this blue paint on their faces and curlers on, like they planned this ahead of time. And everyone was there except for Mr. Jenke, so we all stared at each other. We couldn't get over how nasty and ugly everyone looked at that time in the morning. It was like we had never seen each other before. Finally, Mr. Jenke came squealing up in his Rambler with a huge banner sticking out of the window and about 3 marching kettle drums in his trunk. The kettle drums were for our 2001 number, he said. He also picked up a few marching French horns, too, you know, the kind that stick out straight instead of curling around and back. We hadn't ever seen these things before, and we sure didn't know how to play them. But Mr. Jenke kept mumbling about how sharp we'd look. He said we could practice on the bus. We all thought he stole them from somewhere because he wouldn't say where he got them. On the way down to Lincoln, he had a tape recording of us playing. It was just a racket. Maybe it had only been a bad recording, but we never figured we sounded that bad. And then he claimed that we didn't have time to get out and pee, so about the time we got to Kearney, we started to shout at him, like we were dying, but he wouldn't listen. You'd be surprised how those girls were by the time we got to Grand Island. A couple of them went up to the front of the bus and acted like they were just going to force the driver over to the side of the road. All the drummers were at the back of the bus, grinning at this whole thing, grinning at everything. They'd been at those oranges and peeing into 7-Up bottles and trying to pass them off to this preacher's kid they regularly picked on. By the time we got to Aurora, there was a mutiny. We started yelling, let us out, and rocking the bus back and forth. Finally, Mr. Jenke told the driver to pull into a truck stop, and the girls stood in line, and the guys just peed on the wheels. The drummers went inside the gift shop and robbed the place blind. Each of them had these tiny brown beer mugs, and they were drinking something out of them. Maybe they just put pop in those mugs, but they pretended it was something else. And maybe it was, because back on the bus a half hour later, one of the drummers was starting to throw up. The other drummers just mocked him, imitating the sounds he was making. They didn't feel sorry for him at all. We all threw the windows open and let the cold air slide in. And Mr. Jenke didn't have a clue what was going on. Maybe he was concentrating on our performance. We got to Lincoln in about 6 hours. Mr. Jenke herded us down this ramp into a huge basement where there were about 3 or 4 or 5 dozen marching bands, maybe 2 or 3 or 4,000 kids all tuning up and practicing their music and getting dressed and marching in place. Mr. Jenke was scared. As soon as he saw those bands, he froze and started to shake and shout out, "Get those boys off the beach! They're just piling up on the beach!" One of the Feck boys grabbed him and gave him a shake, but he was plain out of his head, a lot farther than we thought he could go. But finally, at least he knew where he was. He ordered us to get into our uniforms, and then he told us we couldn't lie down or even sit down because we'd wrinkled them, and we weren't due to go on for another 4 hours. So we tried to find the same note to get ourselves in tune, but we got no closer than this awful-sounding chord. Mr. Jenke said, "That's close enough," and then he marched us in place and ran us through our routine about a dozen times. He was slicing through the air with this new baton he just bought, so we tried to stand back from him, but he kept moving in closer. He was swinging his arms and knocking people's hats off. One of the drummers caught an elbow in the temple, and he went down, and that anemic trombone player passed out, and the drum majorette started to cry. We marched in place for almost the whole 4 hours. There were 70 other school fight songs in that room, battling it out. Finally, Mr. Jenke looked at his watch and screamed, "We're on! We're on!" He pushed us down this hallway that smelled like old towels until we were in a dark and quiet place, and we knew we were next. We could see the band that was ahead of us doing their routine. They were from Omaha, and they had 2 ranks filled with nothing but drums. They had 4 tom-toms and 5 kettle drums, and they twirled their sticks. We all glared at our drummers because they were going to be the death of us. But those drummers didn't even look like they knew where they were. They were all leaning against each other, trying to get some rest. Meanwhile, the Omaha band started high-stepping and leaning clear back. Mr. Jenke was watching them too and thinking about something, which is always dangerous. And then he gathered us around him for our pep talk. "Okay," he said, "we're going to do things a little differently." We all moaned. "Shut up," he said. "It's going to be a small change. Instead of marching out like usual, we're going to play Octor Lieber Augustin and Goose Step Out, okay? It'll be cute. And then we'll play 2001. And then when we get to Viva Las Vegas, we'll high step, just like those guys out there, okay? Just lean back and pump those legs high." "No, no, no," we said. "Shut up," Mr. Jenke said. "It's going to look sharp." We tried to talk him out of it, but it was too late. The Omaha band was already marching off, and the lights were going down to get ready for our performance. Now, the only people who knew how to play Octor Lieber Augustin were the trumpets and tubas, just because they liked to cornball around in the band room. They worked out harmonies and everything, but they never played that song in public. But what stunk was our goose stepping. By the time we'd finished, no one was in the right place for 2001, so we all had to shuffle around a bit. The lights flashed on bright just as we started blasting out 2001, and for the first time we saw how big that auditorium was and how many people were there, just like dots in a newspaper photograph. And the trumpets went blah, 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 and the drummers went nuts on the kettle drums. Boom, 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 and then the tubas went boo. But we sounded just like a little dog barking in a great big empty corn bin. That's exactly how we sounded. And if a band can't make 2001 sound big, it can't do anything. And then so many things went wrong after that, nobody even wanted to think about it afterwards. There were so many echoes in that big auditorium that nobody knew who was playing what or when, and we got off tempo, and one of the majorettes stuck out her arms, her zipper came zipping down her back because her outfit was too tight, and she ran off the floor. And then the drummers, damn those drummers anyway, the drummers got turned around so they were always marching just the opposite way from what they should have been marching, and we were dodging each other, and then we were finished. And there wasn't hardly any applause. And we couldn't even figure out how to get off the floor. We just stood there in the silence and stared at each other until Mr. Jenke grabbed one of the drummers by the scruff of the neck, and he hauled that drummer off the floor with his feet kicking, and we all just followed. To make matters worse, the next band came out and did one of those kaleidoscope routines you see the June Taylor dancers do on Jackie Gleason. We crawled up into the high bleachers where no one could see us. We watched them from up there, and Mr. Jenke thought they were so good he practically bawled. During supper, we all tried to talk Mr. Jenke into taking us home, but he said he was going to make us stay around for the award ceremony like it was some kind of punishment. So we had to sit around and watch these bands get superiors and excellence and listen to all those kids stand up and scream like they just won $1 million. And then it came around to us and we got a good. And the dim-witted clarinets stood up and screamed, and Mr. Jenke told them to shut up and sit down and not call attention to us because the awards didn't go any lower than good. After that, we just wanted marching band season to be over. The only trouble was we had one more engagement. We were supposed to march in Brady, Nebraska for the Brady Days. It was stupid. Brady has only about 200 people, hardly enough to line the parade route for a city block, but they didn't want to admit that. So the parade route stretched out, winding back and forth through town, probably so nobody in Brady would have to step off their porch. So we drove down to Brady and formed our ranks and marched along with no one even around to watch us, drumsticks clicking on the rims, trombones and trumpets and clarinets silent. Mr. Jenke marched along beside us in his special director's uniform, but his legs were so long that he kept scooting ahead of us, and then he turned around and scowled like he expected us to catch up. We waited for the drums to get around to playing the roll-off, but there was no one even to play to. We made a wagon wheel corner onto a side street. We didn't even have a trail of fresh manure to follow. Finally, we saw some man with his head under a car hood. He looked at us, his face smudged with grease, so we got the roll-off and played him on Wisconsin. He grinned and wiped his hands on an oil rag so he'd have clean hands to applaud us with. We made another wagon wheel corner just in time to see the horse and banner team a block ahead of us before they turned onto another street. A bunch of old folks had dragged their rockers out on the front lawn, and they started to applaud just as soon as they saw us, even before we started to play. So we played them the Notre Dame fight song, and we did our about-face and cutting through the ranks routine. God, you should have seen those old folks. They were amazed. Of course, we had to do it again to get going back the way we were originally, and they just about went nuts. They didn't stop applauding for a second. At the next corner, there was no one except this kid who stood and said, "They went that way." In appreciation, we stood there and marched in place, and while we played him the soul song, The Horse. The trumpets and trombones just loved that song. They yapped right through it, trying to play it faster than the rest of the band, just showing off. Then we got to the next corner and did a spinning three-quarter left turn and went marching to the south. A dog was standing there, panting a bit, and looking like he was trying to think of something nasty to do. Then we marched on a bit more and noticed the pavement had turned to gravel. We marched some more and noticed that we had left the city limits, and we were marching down a country road with no houses, no trees, just a barbed wire fence with these 3 bay horses standing there watching us. The clarinets and flutes almost fell out of rank to go over and pet them, but they didn't. You could tell they wanted to, though. So we marched on about a mile or so and came to another corner and marched in place, while Mr. Jenke tried to figure out whether to turn left or right or just turn around or go back or what. The most sensible thing would be to turn around, but all of a sudden Mr. Jenke got stubborn, I suppose because he didn't want us to know how lost he really was. So we took a left and marched on about a mile into the country. If you cranked your head around, you could see the town of Brady getting farther and farther away. Some of the kids started moaning, but Mr. Jenke wouldn't listen. We all figured there was something going on in his life to make him do this to us. Whatever it was, we never heard about it. He just made us march. A hawk sat on an old telephone pole that was leaning out of a ditch and glared at us like we were intruders. The gravel road got bumpier. There was grass growing in the middle, and then there were just a couple wagon wheel ruts. And even those wheel ruts vanished, and we were marching through someone's pasture. All of a sudden, Mr. Jenke whipped around. He was marching backward, his cap low over his eyes. He looked real serious. And he blew 1 long whistle and 3 short ones, and we started playing Viva Las Vegas and high-stepping, which made a lot of sense right then because the grass was getting really long. We played about as good as we ever did. We all wished that there had been someone there to watch us aside from those cows. They just stood and stared at us like they figured this was supposed to mean something, but they couldn't figure out what. We marched over a hill and across another pasture. Mr. Jenke didn't act like he was proud of us at all, but he must have been, because we kept in formation and didn't break ranks, not even when a bunch of quail bolted out of the brush, their wingtips clapping just like mad. Thank you. This is, I'll read a poem from Dismal River. And Dismal River is it's kind of a narrative sequence. It's a series of poems that use a trip down the Dismal River in Nebraska as a kind of a unifying device, and then there's shorter poems along the way, and so it's sort of like a framing device. And so you have some part of the poems refer to the river and sort of take you down the river. Then there's sort of pauses, memory and
lyric memory and things like that. There are two characters in the poem. One's the narrator who doesn't have a name. He's like the voice of in the perspective of the poet of the sequence. And then there's a character named Foster who speaks in voice and who's from the area. And this is a poem that's in the voice of Foster. It's called Balot of the Back Road, and it's based on my father, really. My father's one of those people who has a lot more optimism than he really deserves, you know. You sort of take that character like that and you put it together with a mathematical principle that between every 2 points, there's always at least 1 point. Those two things, optimism and that mathematics, kind of come together in this poem. Balot of the Back Road. My father's in business. Takes it a day at a time. Just keeping ahead of the wolves, he says, and goes from Gothenburg looking for a way to find a deal on irrigation pipes. He knows the man will give him credit, and he also knows the farmer he'll deliver it to won't think it too forward to ask for a check. That's how it goes, my father says. No problem. Everything touches everything if you take it by steps. If I get to the bank on time, he says, I'll be able to cover the checks I wrote to sell this pipe, buy lunch, drive back, not counting the dime I'll use to call this man who maybe owes me some. Tomorrow I'll pay off what I owe this other guy, but maybe I'll sell something before then, or maybe I'll take out another note, he says. No problem. Everything touches everything. Now, if you just help me load this load, there's time for maybe another delivery for the cash flow to start tomorrow with. He drives me out to find this farmer's farm, and soon we're lost, driving along rows and rows of corn. And my father says, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to get to this first thing in the morning. Let's start driving back before the gas stations close. He says, no problem, everything touches everything. If you leave out the middle, you'll never come close to what you're trying to get at, which in this case is gasoline. Seems I can't remember where this road goes, he says. No problem, everything touches everything. I'll read another poem. Look at the clock. I'll read this poem. It's called, well, I'll read this poem here. Decide what I want to read. This poem is called the Snow Queen, and it's based upon the story by Hans Christian Andersen. And I was, I have, when my son Joseph, and this is dedicated to my son, when he was like about, 2-3 years old, we got a videotape from the library, these different kinds of fairy tales and things like that. And there was one, it was a Snow Queen, and I started watching it, and it's the creepiest story I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it just completely freaked me out. And of course, you wonder whoever got the idea that this is children's literature, but it's, I know probably, and it wasn't originally, but it's also very, there's so many levels of meaning in that little story. So I decided to rewrite the story and sort of dedicate it to Joseph. The title of it, The Snow Queen, by Hans Christian Andersen, for Joseph. Ever since she discovered the mirror didn't love her, she's been looking for you. Ever since that glass fell and shattered into smithereens, you've seen ice flowers gathering in your window. Some say she's sewn herself into her own grave with pinpricks of snow, a seamstress who mends the earth and sky into a hole. Others say a broken mirror's an open door. They point to her tattered grave gown shimmering in the northern lights. They tell you that's her loneliness, where the grains of the mirror are drifting. But this is what they never tell you. If one of the shards ever enters your eye, then nothing will ever look right again. And if a piece of the mirror ever enters your brain, far worse, soon you will forget the pain and go on living as before. Well, okay, that's cheerful. I'll read you another story. This is a story that's called A Bedtime Story. I guess that follows Hans Christian Andersen, but it's not a very appropriate bedtime story. If you can imagine it, and I think it's pretty clear, imagine it that an old man is telling this story to his grandchildren. A bedtime story. Okay, now, this is your story, and I'm only going to tell you one, so no whining when I'm finished. This happened when your mommy was a little girl. We all went out just before Halloween looking for a good-sized pumpkin to carve up.
out to this farm we heard about. Your mommy had a pretty basket, and she walked around and loaded up with tiny gourds and squash and blue and white Indian corn. It was autumn, and some of the leaves were hanging in the air, and some were floating down, and some were still on the trees, but they were reaching towards the earth like they could hardly wait to get themselves down and stretch out a bit. This farm had a load of peacocks, too. Every once in a while, one would come flying out of the barn like he was scared of something in there, and your mommy got scared, too. She came running to me and climbed in my arms, wanting me to help the bird, but I didn't know what she meant until I heard the peacock calling out, "Help! Help! Help!" So then I knew where she was getting this. That peacock would come running out of the barn, trying to get airborne and yelling help and help like he hardly thought he'd get through the day alive. There were these other birds, too, a couple guineas and turkeys and a lot of fancy stuck-up chickens. And when we were walking around the farmyard, we came on these geese, which kind of lowered their heads at us and hissed like they were mean, so I kept your mommy close. And then I saw a Studebaker nighthawk. I could hardly believe it. It was up on blocks there in the back, right out there in the open, a beautiful, long, low car with just a bubble of a cab. And it had fins, too, just like what I always wanted. I always wanted a car like that. So then this farmer who owned this farm, he came up to me and introduced himself, and I said to him, "So, Chris, you going to sell me this car?" And he says, "Nope." So then I surprised myself by naming flat out a price, a good one, too. But he turned me down and says the reason why he can't sell me the car is because the car belongs to his brother, and his brother is dead. Well, the paint on that Nighthawk had pretty much gone to dust anyway, all blasted away by the sunlight. The thought of that beautiful car out in the open almost made me sick. But I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business. I was afraid that if I said something, I'd just get mad. This Chris fellow was pretty quiet, too. But I noticed he was shifting around like he felt guilty about something. And pretty soon he says, "No, I just can't sell you that Nighthawk. But why don't you go ahead and take your pick of all these pumpkins? And you can take all you want. And you can have them for free, too." Well, I guess he wanted to make it up to us. And that was pretty nice of him. And I told him so. And he just says, "Oh, those pumpkins just grow out in the compost anyway. I don't even have to coax them along." So your mommy got her pick of all those pumpkins. They were gnarly and twisted looking and lopsided, almost too scary to carve a face into. They looked like if you stuck a knife into one of them, you just might let something loose, something you really didn't want let loose. And your mom, she picked out the homeliest, saddest pumpkin you ever saw, almost like she felt sorry for them. And there was one pumpkin that was homelier than all the rest, and that was the one she wanted to carry around like it was her baby doll. And you know what she told me? She told me she was going to give that pumpkin a face. Hell, it almost had a face already, or at least the beginnings of one, like it didn't quite get finished with the job of growing a face before it got picked. Chris hung out with me while I watched your mommy pick out her pumpkins, and for a long time he didn't say anything. And then he walked us to our car like it was some kind of obligation, and he watched us load up the pumpkins, and it looked like he was just going to stand there and stare at us while we were driving off, when all of a sudden he says, "But you know, I got a chimp in the shed if you want to see that. I can show him to you and your daughter if you'd like." "A chimp, you say?" And he says, "Yup." And then he says, "He's pretty old, though." He said that like he was warning us, like he didn't want us to be disappointed. So I asked your mommy, "You want to see a chimpanzee?" And she did, of course, so we went to see the guy's chimp. Turned out that the shed was a fair walk from where we were, back through a bunch of machinery sheds and old equipment and grain bins, and then a ways across this old pumpkin graveyard, rotted pumpkins all over the place. Well, I was holding on to your mama's hand and helping her wade through the weeds, and I was having second thoughts. To tell the truth, I got a little nervous about that old man all of a sudden, because I really didn't know him. If I were on my own, then going to some stranger's shed might be okay. But I had your mommy there to think about, and I don't know, but my imagination got away from me. I started to think that he might not have a chimp in that shed at all. I started to think he might have... All of a sudden, I had the clear image that maybe have some hitchhiker there, all tied up. So I started getting antsy. And then when we came on that shed, I saw a big pile of sawed-off antlers there. They looked like a pile of bones, and that didn't give me any comfort at all. Chris fooled with the padlock while I stood there and stared at those antlers. And then we went into the shed, and we saw there was a chimp in there all right. He was hunkered over in a big cage, and it had a red-hot pot-bellied stove blazing next to him. He wasn't moving, though. He was staring at the wall like he was pouting about something. There were bushels and bushels of baskets of green tomatoes and old potatoes and carrots beside the cage. And there were the chewed up remains of potatoes and green tomatoes all over the floor. Your mommy was disgusted. You should have seen her. I'd give $10 whole right now for the look on her face. Chris started saying, "Now, don't let your little girl get too close. Don't get close now because this here animal spits." And almost like the chimp understood, he jumped up and spit out pieces of chewed up carrots and then showed us his teeth. I couldn't tell if he was happy or just being a smart ass. "Now, don't get too close," Chris says. The chimp bit into a tomato, chewed it up real careful, and started spitting that towards us, spraying it really. And Chris got mad at him and he says, "Now see here," and he says, "You there, you cut that out." And he raised his hand and the chimp seemed to flinch and duck. And so I wondered whether or not Chris beat that chimp, but I didn't say anything about it. Chris says, "Oh, he only acts like that when strangers are around. He's just an old faker, really. He won't hurt anyone." And to prove this, Chris walked right up to the cage and put his hand inside. Let me tell you, that made me so nervous that I picked up your mama and held her. I almost couldn't stand it. I just wanted to scoop her up and get the hell out of there. But then, just as soon as Chris put his arm in the cage, that chimp kind of petted it. And then the chimp reached through the bars real careful and patted Chris on the shoulder. And I thought, well, that looks sweet, like there was some affection between them. But then I noticed how much Chris was shaking. And I noticed how slowly each of them was moving, like they didn't want to spook each other with any fast movements. Then I could see that the only reason why they were so careful with each other was because they didn't hardly trust each other at all. I could see that plain. Finally, Chris pulled his arm away from the chimp and stood back, and he says to me, "Care to guess how old he is?" I couldn't really tell. The chimp was kind of gray around the muzzle, but I didn't have any basis for comparison. "He's 15 years old, Chris says, sounding like he was bragging about it. "And I've had him since he was 2. And he used to have a mate, too, but she died young. She got a cough one night when the stove went out." I looked at that chimp sitting there looking bored and depressed, and I asked Chris, "Have you ever let the chimp out?" And Chris says, "No, not much at least, not for a long time." Well, that kind of got to me, too. It was the same thing as with that Nighthawk, that beautiful car sitting out in the open and rotting in the sun, and here that chimp was being kept in a cage. This Chris guy just wanted to know where they were, just wanted to hang on to them and own them. He really didn't care about them. And the Nighthawk was one thing, but this was a living creature. So I said to him, "It's not too late now. Maybe that chimp would appreciate being let out once in a while." To tell the truth, I didn't think that what I'd said would matter to this Chris so much. But right away he got this kind of guilty look. Or maybe it was kind of a perplexed look. I mean, he looked like he was studying the point, like he never thought of it before. And pretty soon he says, "Well, But then he was quiet and studying the point again. "Well, I just don't know," he says. I was standing there waiting for him just to get it out when I noticed that the chimp's hair was thin on his rump, like a pair of pants gone out in the seat. Like the chimp spent a lot of time just sitting there. "Well, he says, I just might do that, but I don't know. What's there to do around here anyway? My brother was always saying he was bored, too. Nothing to do. So he goes off to that war, and he never comes back. So then I started into thinking, that's what looking for excitement will get you. Ain't worth the bother. We didn't even get his body back." That's what he said. I saw it was pretty much useless to try to talk to him about it. Those old farmers usually want to do things their own way and not be meddled with. "But I want you to know we don't mistreat this animal," Chris says. "Nor siree, I want you to know we hose him down real often, and you can see he gets plenty of food. You just look at him. He's got good fur. There ain't a bit of the mange on that chimp, and that's a fact. Take a look and see for yourself." I admitted that I knew enough about animals that I could see its fur was good. I didn't doubt that he took good care of it, and I told him so. I just thought he should let the chimp out once in a while. But Chris seemed to be stuck on the fact of whether or not the animal was healthy. Chris says, "I want you to take a good look at that animal, and if that animal has any mange, well, then I want you to lock me up too. Come on, step up here and look at him." So then I admitted I really didn't care to. I said I could see the animal well enough from where I was, and I really didn't want to get any closer. "Oh, come on up here. Good Lord, take a look at this chimp. Your daughter, too. He's calmed down by now." "I think we'll have to pass on that," I said. "Oh, come on now," he says. "He ain't going to hurt anyone." "No," I said. "No, we really can't do it, and we really have to be going now." Well, when I said that, Chris just stared at me with a hurt look in his eye. From the way he looked, you'd think that I'd insulted him. "I suppose you don't think we treat the animal right," he finally says. "Well, I want you to know that it just ain't true. You're not being fair to me or this chimp." And like he was going to prove the point, all of a sudden this Chris grabbed a box of flea powder. He stepped towards the cage like he was getting ready to give that chimp a fresh dusting, and right away the chimp got a wide-eyed look, and he got up on his back legs like he was getting ready to protect himself. The chimp showed his teeth and bounced back and forth on his heels with his arms in the air, bouncing up and down and making these angry chimp sounds, a lot of hooting with some screaming. And when Chris got close enough, one of the chimp's arms shot out of that cage, and that chimp had a reach. I guess that he wanted to grab the box of flea powder and get away from Chris, but it didn't work. Chris doused that animal with white powder anyway, and the chimp cried out. And then real slow, he sat back on his haunches and lowered his head, and he hunched down low and still like he was humiliated. What could we do then? I just said to Chris that we'd probably bothered him enough, and he didn't act like he was inclined to disagree. He says, "Oh, okay, well, okay, but could you wait for a second? Just give me a second and I'll be right with you." You know, I've always had a hard time ending a conversation. You could probably say that's a fault of mine. So I carried your mommy outside and we waited just to shake this guy's hand and tell him thank you, really, because that's how I was raised. So I stood there and waited, letting my eyes rest on that pile of sawed-off antlers. I put your mommy down. Those antlers were about waist deep and so dense they looked like they growed there. Your mommy walked over to them and she picked up one of the antlers. She just picked it up and looked at it. I said, "Put it down, sweetheart," because I knew by now this old man was particular and wouldn't want anything on his farm disturbed. And your mommy was reluctant, but she minded me like she always did. But the way she stared at those antlers, I knew she really wanted to pick one out. So I thought I might as well ask this Chris for one, as a keepsake, you know. But I never got the chance to, because pretty soon he came out of the shed, holding on to that chimp's hand and leading him. The chimp kind of waddled beside him. Chris says, "See here, this chimp won't hurt no one." Well, I practically shouted at Chris. I said, "I really didn't mean that you should let him out while we were here." And I went to grab hold of your mommy again, but before I could do it, that chimp broke free and scooted for the pile of antlers. Soon as he got there, he put two of them on his head, and your mommy just giggled. She thought that was really funny. We used to have a lot of animals, Chris says. It was my brother who started me buying them and all. We had a llama and a Brahma bull and some wild animals too, deer and elk, but I killed them all. About 10 years ago, we had this little silver fox that folks thought was really cute. Everyone was always coming out to have their pictures of their kids taken with that fox. And everything was fine until that fox bit this little girl, and then damn it, all hell broke loose. I looked over at your mommy when Chris said that, and I saw that the chimp was lightly touching her hair with his fingertips. I tell you, I didn't like that at all. At first, she just stood there and let him do it, but then she stepped back, and the chimp jerked back his paw too, like he touched something hot. I said, "You know, I really wish you'd keep an eye on that chimp of yours." But Chris kept on talking. Thank God that chimp got bored quick. He waddled over behind Chris and stood there with his hands on Chris's kneecaps, and he looked at me from between Chris's legs, peeling back his lips and grinning, but Chris didn't seem to notice him. Chris says, "First off, I find out that her daddy's a sheriff, and he starts in raising hell. So we had to kill the fox and have its head sent in to check for rabies. Well, I just couldn't stand it. Been here all my life, never had any trouble in the world, but then people start to meddle with you, and it ain't ever the same. So I just killed the whole lot of them, just in one day, from sunrise to sunset, and they were all dead then, except for that chimp and the birds. I was trying to kill the birds too, but I couldn't seem to catch them. I would never dream of killing that chimp, though. I guess you could say that chimp owes me his life. Seems like a dream, I was so angry. I was running around with a shotgun, all in a fever to get it done, and it'd take hardly nothing to do it either. Most of those animals I just burned in a big fire at the end of the day. Kept those antlers, though. I don't know why." And that was his story. "How about that?" I said. "Well, we best be going now." About then, the chimp crawled all the way through Chris's legs and held out his arms to Chris. But Chris says, No, you're too big, understand? I can't carry you." But he did take that chimp's hand, and the two of them walked us to our car. I could see that your mommy really liked that chimp. She didn't want to get very close to him, though, and that was fine with me. I started liking that chimp myself, especially after he ran off those geese when they got too close. I also liked it when he got a twig and started digging up an ant pile. He sure knew how to amuse himself. I gave Chris one more chance. "So you going to sell me that car?" But he knew I was just kidding. He smiled and shook my hand, and we drove away, and that's the last I ever saw of him. But you know something? On the way home, your mama was talking to her pumpkins like they were her babies. And that night, after we got home, we carved those pumpkins out and made a bunch of jack-o'-lanterns and dumped the seeds and goop out behind our house in this empty lot. And about 1,000,000 pumpkins grew up the next year, all of them twisted and lopsided like there was something wrong with them. Nothing was, though. They were all interesting to look at, and they made a good pie. I'll finish by reading a couple poems. This poem is called My Parents' Tombstone. This is probably not the only thing that's like in my voice that I'm going to read. My Parents' Tombstone. My mother photocopied the picture in the catalog and sent it to me. With whiteout, she covered over whosever name was on the showroom model, writing in their own names with the careful hand she used to print the alphabet for 6-year-olds, along with the dates of their birth and 2 blanks after that, the hyphen representing their unfinished lives. This alarmed me, you understand, to open up a letter and unfold the stone. I guess she wanted me to see the marker they purchased. It was something my brother and sister and I wouldn't have to worry about when that day came round. It was their gift to us. And so I should have maybe thanked her, but how do you thank someone for a gift like that? It's a good stone, but oh, I would have picked a different location. Their grave will be in the yard of a church that's moved to town, leaving its graveyard stranded in the country. It's a graveyard filled by my father's people, and my mother made him mad when she told him she wanted to keep her maiden name after they are buried. There are good people there for sure, but not enough trees, and on my parents' side, no trees at all. It leaves their grave open to the encroachment of greedy farmers edging in to plant another row of corn. And what I like least about the place is the pig farm across the road. You can hear the clank of pig feeders all times of the day and half the night. You can hear the pigs grunt with satisfaction at their constant supply of grub and watch them roll in the mud, not to mention the smell. These pigs are pampered, kingly even, as they romp in the sun. They are smart enough to know the time of the day they'll be fed. They wait by the fence. They grow angry if their food is late. But they are too stupid to know they are raised for the knife. This alone is bad enough, this arrogant stupidity, not to mention the day they'll disturb my grief, squealing and biting each other as they line up at the trough. I'll read one more poem, and then this is I don't know. This is a poem where for years and years and years, I saw a painting in the Sheldon Art Gallery when I was an undergraduate called My Egypt, and Charles Demuth is the painter. And I forgot the painter for many, many years, but I remember the title. And every time I would see, for years after this, every time I would see like corn silos or augers or things like this, like the scaffolding of a small town, I would think, my Egypt, this is my Egypt. And so one day I decided to figure out why I was, that kept coming back to me. So this poem's called My Egypt. And it's sort of like in the voice of someone who's a guide. My Egypt. There's a code of bird tracks in the mud along the Platte. Fish hooks, feathers, and an undulating line, a snake that prints itself among the flakes of freckled shells. Here, schools of flies attempt to read aloud the parchment of a bloated fawn, and the smell drives you away across the floodplain, where a gaping footpath eats into a hill, ravenous, cancerous, widening as the generations climb to vandalize the concrete Indian tilting at the top. The hill is vanishing beneath its feet. But here you can see the 30-mile canal cut a sharp ruled line across the Crescent Valley, while the intestinal river bends back on itself, turns against itself, fans out in many veins to feed the black soil. There are pioneer tombs carved into these hills, an unmarked exodus. You cannot see them, but you can see the farmers huddled around a church, their graveyards draped in black, the black plowed fields. And if you wait long enough, at least until evening, You will hear the locusts crawling out between the pages of 1,000 Bibles and prophesy, Nebraska, Nebraska, Nebraska is a fat calf waiting for the knife. And as proof of this, the graves consent to bleed in the sunset. The haunted air starts creeping from the packing plants. The summer passes away. The rains do not come. It is then that you should pack your migrant's bundle and go out of this Egypt, for after the locusts chirp and trill themselves into a hungry trance, and after 7 thin cows have come to devour the shriveled husks of 7 years of corn, all that will remain of my Egypt is this: the monuments of triangular augurs rising on scaffolds against the cloudless desert sky, and the white and hollow bone shanks of the grain elevators, and the river writhing and thrashing in its sleep until it flattens all that stands upright, and the black, black alluvial soil that stays behind to feed upon these tombs. Thank you.